Everybody, we will start in 2 minutes. Thank you. Susan.
Thank you. Thank you for joining the joint UN and INPEA annual commemoration of World Elder Abuse Awareness Day 2021. I'd like to welcome you all, and I'd like to thank our partners and sponsors, UN DESA, OHCHR, WHO, UNFPA, and the NGO Committees on Aging in New York and Geneva. Special recognition goes to Sylvia Perel-Levin, without whom most of this would not be possible. And of course, to the interpreters for their patience and dedication. I'd like to acknowledge this webinar is in part organized thanks to the project, Empowerment of Older Women, Prevention of Violence Through Changing Social Norms in Serbia and Austria, the EmPreV project, supported by the European Union and Austrian Development Agency. This past year has seen unacceptable levels of preventable suffering and deaths of older persons. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and exacerbated the systemic day-to-day discrimination faced by older people in virtually every country, subjecting them to ageist hate speech and stigmatization. Many older persons, particularly older women, are suffering intolerable levels of violence, abuse, and neglect, both at homes and in institutions. The failure to protect the rights of older citizens and provide avenues to seek justice and redress cannot be excused. However, we believe that we can make a difference, and we call on member states to adopt the recommendations of the UN Secretary General, who called in his policy brief of May 2020 to build stronger legal frameworks and accelerate the efforts to develop proposals for an international legal instrument to promote and protect the rights and dignity of older persons. Distinguished speakers and friends, seize the opportunity of WEAAD to urge your government to take courageous, the just step to begin drafting the text for a binding UN convention to protect the rights of all older people. The time is now to act for older persons of today and those of the future. On behalf of INPEA, founders of the International Day, I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Thank you. And I now give the floor to the moderator, Sylvia.
Thank you, Susan. And welcome, everyone. I am Sylvia Perel-Levin, chair of the NGO Committee on Aging in Geneva and representative of INPEA to the UN. Before I introduce you our esteemed panel of speakers, some small housekeeping notes. We are having interpretation in several languages. As you can see on the lower right, we have interpretation to French, German, Russian, Serbian, and Spanish. Most of the speakers will speak English. We have one speaker who will speak in Spanish, but we have interpretation, so use it. And also we have captions, so if you need to read the captions, you can enable them on your screen. And please use the chat box for comments, or you can submit questions to the questions and answer tabs, and we will do our best to pose them to the experts during the rounds of questions and answers. So we have an esteemed group of experts lined up here for you, for all of us. With us, we have Claudia Mahler, the UN independent expert on the enjoyment of all human rights by older persons, Maria Soledad Cisterna-Reyes, Special Envoy to the UN Secretary General on Disability and Accessibility, Etienne Krug, Director of the Department of Social Determinants of Health at the World Health Organization, Natasa Todorovic, Health and Care Program Manager, Red Cross of Serbia, and INPEA representative to Europe, and Bill Mitchell, Principal Solicitor in Townsville Community Law Inc. in Australia. All our experts, our panelists will be on the screen all the time, on the gallery. We will spotlight the speakers, but before the actual panel, we also have a representative of member states who will honor us with some opening remarks. And we are very honored and happy to welcome first the Ambassador Federico Villegas, permanent representative of Argentina to the United Nations in Geneva, and he also co-chairs the group of friends of the human rights of older persons in Geneva. Mr. Ambassador, your floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, and congratulations for this timely event. I would like to share a few thoughts on why is it important, not only the event, but the theme of today's Awareness Day, which is access to justice. First of all, we know that all human rights, without exception, need to have access to justice in order to be fully realized. We have been having 75 years of the creation of the international human rights law, and it seems that it has been an old issue of a long time, but actually it's the tip of the iceberg of what the future is waiting for us on the development of human rights, because we know all the challenges we have ahead. During those 75 years, we were able to have particular instruments for the protection of certain groups of persons. All those persons were human beings that were covered by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. There's no doubt they are human beings. But the international community made a cultural change, a philosophical change, and a juridical change, saying that those groups needed a special protection by an international instrument. And of course, I'm talking about women, I'm talking about children, and I'm talking about persons with disabilities. In different times in these 75 years, we were able to build the case why we did. What did they have in common, those three groups of persons? We can have many, but two are characteristics that they had in common and why they were able to get their own convention. First, there was a structural discrimination, legal and social, of those groups, with the stereotypes and stigmatization. And second, there was a vulnerability, a situation of vulnerability that was not created because they themselves had conditions in themselves that make them vulnerable. The problem is that the society put those groups in a vulnerable situation because of precisely the theme of this event, the lack of the possibility of those groups to access to justice by themselves, to have their human rights respected. And therefore, these three created through this a cultural change at a global level on the three issues. And today we look at those three groups in a different way. Thanks, among other things, to the discussion, negotiation, adoption, and follow-up of those three international conventions. CEDAW, Convention of the Rights of the Child, and Conventions on the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities. Now is the time for another cultural change to give access to justice to another group of persons that has had the experience of a situation of vulnerability, not because they are in themselves vulnerable, but because they suffer abuse and structural discrimination and have society that puts them in a vulnerable situation. And as the last point, if this was just a discussion, an abstract philosophical experts discussion for the last 10 years in the open-ended working group in New York. Unfortunately, COVID puts us in the flesh of real people losing their lives, those abstract discussions of the last 10 years. So definitely we need to make a new cultural change and start as soon as possible to discuss this way of creating a new step in the international human rights law for the protection of other persons. And COVID puts us in a situation of a point of no return because we know how they have suffered and the lack of access to justice that they have had during this pandemic. So thank you very much. And I hope that we can have a good discussion in the next year on this issue. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and you are welcome to stay in the panel, and then maybe somebody would like to ask you a question at the end. Thank you very much. Now, the ambassador of the Philippines to the UN in New York wanted to be here, but he couldn't, but he did send a recorded video. So we will put the message from the Ambassador Enrique Austria Manalo, permanent representative of the Philippines to the UN in New York, and also member of the group of Friends of Older Persons in New York. We are going to put the
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank UN DESA, the International Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, and other organizers for inviting me to speak at today's commemoration of the World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. The Philippines is committed to advance the rights and well-being of older persons, especially during this pandemic that has been devastating for older persons. We are supportive of efforts to develop an international legal instrument for the human rights of older persons. The theme of today's event is very timely. Equal access to justice and legal empowerment is a core element of the rule of law. It was a topic discussed in depth at one of the interactive panels of the recently held 11th session of the General Assembly Open-Ended Working Group on Aging. Older persons have the right to be free from harm, from all forms of violence, abuse, and neglect, both in private and public settings. When older persons become subjected to these criminal acts, they should be guaranteed access to justice, including to restitution and reparation. In the Philippines, free access to courts and quasi-judicial bodies and adequate legal assistance is guaranteed by our Constitution. This right cannot be denied to any person for any reason. Elder abuse persists in all societies, even with legal measures in place to prevent it. The phenomenon continues to grow, even though the General Assembly officially recognized the problem 10 years ago and designated a day of awareness on it. Issues of elder abuse continue to receive inadequate research and policy attention. Where data exists, it shows that this is a growing area of concern, exacerbated by the increased risk of vulnerability owing to emergency situations. COVID-19 related public health measures, for example, as well as increased stress on caregivers, may amplify factors associated with increased risk of violence, neglect, and abuse to which older persons are subjected. Elder abuse often remains largely hidden within families. We know that deficiencies in legal processes deter reporting by victims. Many governments often rely on self-reporting or reporting by non-governmental organizations or media outlets, or on measures targeted at women and families. In the Philippines, the Department of Justice maintains an action center in every region of the country to act on complaints, requests for legal assistance, and queries made by telephone as well as in person. Further, appropriate measures are needed for more effective legislation and policies to ensure that all forms of violence, abuse, and neglect are identified, investigated, and redressed in a manner both proportionate and compatible with the right to autonomy and independence. Thank you.
And thank you to both ambassadors in New York and in Geneva. We, civil society, are constantly trying to work across silos and across geography, so to make sure that we together can further and improve the rights of older persons. And now we go into the panel, and I have the great honor to invite the independent expert, Claudia Mahler. You have observed and reported on violations of human rights of older persons, including elder abuse and neglect during the current pandemic. Why do we need to ensure access to justice in cases of elder abuse? Claudia, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. And first of all, let me thank all the organizers for the kind invitation and also for the kind introduction. I'm really honored to be with you today. And I would also like to congratulate the organizers to the achievement to mobilize us all for this important event to mark the World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. As you already said, violence, abuse, and neglect have increased during the pandemic. And we have witnessed and heard that older persons had difficulties to access to justice before and during the pandemic. We are still at the stage to raise awareness to the human rights of older persons. And we need to tackle the taboo of violence, abuse, and neglect. One issue why older persons do not proceed with the avenue on access to justice: they are lacking information. Their rights and the avenues to claim the enjoyment of their human rights are very often unknown to older persons. Many older persons do not qualify different actions as abuse and violations of their right. They are used to suffer from undignified treatment and that their rights are violated. We already heard that elder abuse is one of the most underreported human rights violations, and we can only change this by breaking the taboo and discussing the different forms of violence, abuse, and neglect. Until today, we are still missing disaggregated data on violence, abuse, and neglect on old age. Violence on older persons is mostly invisible in statistics. Lack of detailed information and analysis limits the possibility to reveal abuse patterns and determine the gaps in existing interventions. The absence of data leads to lack of needed concrete action to provide adequate protection to older persons. Despite widespread alarm over the situation of older persons during the pandemic, the challenges and barriers to seek effective redress and remedies for reported violations received little attention. On the contrary, disturbing practices were reported to us. For example, healthcare providers and care institutions being given immunity from civil liability for COVID-19 related deaths and injuries. Even before the pandemic, some nursing homes in some countries were reportedly allowed to introduce contractual clauses that waive the right to file a court case and make arbitration the only option in the event of abuse and mistreatment. We need to change this practice. Older persons deserve the enjoyment of their rights. Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. But tell me, Claudia, then, what prevents older persons to access the justice that it is, in fact, for everybody, isn't it?
It is, and as said before, most of the older persons are not aware of their rights. And this is also true for all of us, to be honest. First of all, therefore, we need to ensure that everybody, including older persons, have a chance to get more knowledge on the human rights in connection with elder abuse. And from my perspective, there are also a couple of other barriers why older persons do not get access to justice. Court procedures are the least resource of everybody and refers to maybe we need some easily accessible ways to remedies and redress outside the court procedures. One of my good proposals, I would say, might be to establish an independent procedure or body, possibly within an existing independent body, with the mandate to examine complaints pertaining to older persons. Another barrier, which is very often reported, is that it's very hard to get support for claiming one's rights. Legal advice might be too costly and of not easily accessible. Another thing which hinders older persons to go to court also is that the judicial procedure is stressful and it might take too long to get good results. From the perspective of persons in later life, it might not be seen worth to go all these ways for the effort. To overcome some of the barriers, I like to encourage states to provide older persons organizations their associational standing to sue, thereby allowing for strategic litigation or opt-in collective action, or to establish collective redress mechanisms that are tailored to overcome the particular difficulties encountered by older persons. Individual claims could thus be combined with collective action on behalf of a group of older victims by qualified entities, such as older persons organizations or associations or state bodies. But we have also to keep in mind and say it out loud. Older persons are rights holders whose dignity and rights do not have an expiration date in later life. Therefore, we need to ensure that to give them all the support and assistance which is needed. Access to justice encompasses the right to a fair trial, equal access to and equality before the courts, and the right to seek and obtain just and timely remedies for human rights violation. Furthermore, entrenched ageist attitudes hinder older persons in claiming their rights and undermine older persons' autonomy to make their own choices and decisions. Unfortunately, I would also like to add that the gap on access to justice is also reflected at the international level. We are still lacking, as already heard, a current international binding human rights framework which would set a universal baseline on monitoring and accountability mechanism to ensure the rights of older persons are taken into account in the justice system. A binding human rights instrument would guide states on the implementation of human rights of older persons. It would define specific standards and principles of the obligation of states and other duty bearers to enable the exercise of the rights. And I hope this would mean access to justice for older persons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. As we see, that's a recurrent issue of the convention that we will discuss further. And there are already some questions coming in, and we will come back to you, Claudia, on the panelists, after we finish with all the panelists. Now, I like to call Maria Soledad Cisterna Reyes. She is a special envoy of the UN Secretary General on Disability and Accessibility. And it's a great honor to have Maria Soledad with us. She will speak in Spanish, and because of that, I will ask her as well the questions in Spanish, and that's why I invite you, those who haven't set the interpretation to English or the other language, do it now if you need to. María Soledad, bienvenida. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. Es un placer realmente tenerte con nosotros. María Soledad, tú has sido secretaria presidenta, en realidad, del Comité sobre los Derechos de las Personas con Discapacidad.
¿Puedo comenzar, Silvia?
Sí, ¿me escuchas? Te estoy haciendo, ¿me escuchas?
¿Qué dice que sí?
¿No me escuchas?
Sí, ahora sí.
Te pregunto, la pregunta es, ¿qué podemos aprender de la Convención sobre los Derechos de las Personas con Discapacidad con respecto al acceso a la justicia? ¿Es todo aplicable también a las personas mayores?
Bueno, Silvia, en primer lugar quiero agradecer la invitación que me han hecho para participar en este importante día de toma de conciencia en relación a la violencia y abuso contra las personas mayores. Agradezco a la red que se dedica a este tema y especialmente a ti, Silvia, con todo aprecio, con toda admiración y cariño, porque estás ahí firme con el tema. Y yo encantada de participar, y lo primero que quiero decir es que creo que es muy importante que exista una convención internacional para la promoción y protección de los derechos de las personas mayores. Si bien es cierto, yo voy a hablar de la Convención en Discapacidad, pero tenemos que tener claro que son dos titulares de derecho distintos, porque la persona con discapacidad implica una deficiencia que tenga la persona, y nadie puede decir que el envejecimiento es en sí una deficiencia. La persona con discapacidad se define por esa deficiencia, su interacción con barreras y cómo eso restringe la participación en la sociedad. En tanto que la persona mayor corresponde a un rango etario determinado. Y eso es todo, pero igual se aplica un modelo de derechos humanos que debe ser firme para ser puesto en la comunidad internacional. Dicho esto, y respondiendo tu pregunta, evidentemente hay tal vez algunas partes en la vida en que una persona mayor puede llegar a tener discapacidad. No todas las personas mayores tienen discapacidad, eso hay que tenerlo muy claro. Hay autonomía, autovalencia en muchas personas mayores. Por lo tanto, el cruce que estamos haciendo es en aquella parte de personas mayores que tengan discapacidad, y aquí la Convención nos entrega importantes elementos, porque por un lado nos refuerza el modelo de derechos humanos de las personas con discapacidad, y en cuanto al acceso a la justicia nos dice que los estados deben asegurar, garantizar el acceso a la justicia de todas las personas con discapacidad en igualdad de condiciones con los demás, incluso mediante ajustes de procedimiento adecuados a la edad, para facilitar el rol efectivo de la persona en toda clase de procedimientos y cualquiera sea el papel que tenga, y esto en etapas preliminares o investigativas del proceso. Entonces, aquí nos encontramos con un importante elemento que son los ajustes de procedimiento. Ya antes ustedes se referían a cómo dar espacios diversos, por ejemplo, para prestar una audiencia, o por ejemplo, si una persona requiere intermedio entre una prestación de testimonio, descansar entre medio, o si una persona le facilita ver imágenes para poder identificar hechos, ir describiendo una situación mediante imágenes. Bueno, hay muchas formas de ajustes de procedimiento. ¿Cómo pueden hacerse esto? En la ley, pero también la judicatura, porque las cortes tienen la facultad de dictar normas internas que regulan a los tribunales de justicia. Y por lo mismo, entonces, pueden allí incorporar ajustes de procedimiento. Pero finalmente será el juez que, frente a una persona con discapacidad, que puede ser una persona mayor en algún caso, tenga que efectuar ajustes específicos para esa persona con nombre y apellido. Y ahí operará el criterio del juez, operará cuán capacitado esté en el modelo de derechos humanos de personas con discapacidad. Entonces, otro elemento importante es la accesibilidad que debe tener el espacio físico, la información, las comunicaciones del tribunal en cuanto a los recursos, en cuanto a cómo se desenvuelve el proceso. Pero además, un aspecto importante, la capacidad jurídica. Ninguna norma para proteger del maltrato a una persona con discapacidad, y lo mismo le hace de una persona mayor, puede hacer que la persona quede privada de su capacidad jurídica, que se le declare interdicta y que se le elimine esa facultad. Hoy día la Convención en Discapacidad habla de la voluntad con apoyo, no a través de tutores o curadores, no a través de representantes, sino el apoyo a la persona para que entregue su voluntad. ¿ya? Y estos apoyos tendrán salvaguardia para evitar el abuso, el conflicto de intereses, la influencia indebida, y deberán ser medidas revisadas por los tribunales. Otro aporte de la convención son las capacitaciones que debe tener permanentemente el personal de la Administración de Justicia, como también el personal policial y penitenciario que tienen que ver con el acceso a la justicia. Entonces, esta capacitación debe ser sustantiva en el modelo de derechos humanos y en los ajustes procesales. Quiero decir que la Convención Interamericana para la Protección de los Derechos Humanos de las Personas Mayores agrega elementos como la tutela judicial efectiva de las personas mayores. Es un gran referente la Convención Interamericana de Personas Mayores. Habla del derecho a ser oído de la persona mayor en un tiempo razonable, que tiene el derecho preferente para ser atendido de manera rápida, e incluso habla de ser atendido de manera expedita cuando está en riesgo la vida y la salud de la persona mayor. Por eso mismo es que es muy importante tener en cuenta este referente, el único que hay a nivel regional para las personas mayores. Concluyo diciendo que esto tiene que vincularse también a la Agenda de Desarrollo Sostenible. El ODS 16 habla del acceso a la justicia para todos, y en las metas habla que esto se relaciona con el Estado de Derecho en los países, y para perseguir violencias, abusos, maltratos, negligencias, tortura y discriminación. Yo quiero dejar hasta aquí, porque después, si a alguien le interesa preguntar sobre los plazos de implementación, me encantaría hablar sobre eso. Así que, dentro del tiempo, Silvia, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a ti, María Soledad, y gracias por referirte a puntos muy críticos. Y sé que te tienes que ir antes porque estás en la apertura de la conferencia de State Parties de la CRPD. I am saying that I'm thanking Maria Soledad, and she will have to leave a bit earlier because she's in the opening session of the Conference of State Parties on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So when we start with the questions and answers, she will be the first one to ask her a question in case she has to go to the other panel. Thank you so much. You filled us with enormous amount of important information, and we will back to you. Now I go straight to the health sector. I am pleased to invite Dr. Etienne Krug. He's director of the Department of Social Determinants of Health in WHO, in charge of the work on demographics and aging, population aging. Etienne, Dr. Krug, tell us, what is the role of public health in enabling older persons in accessing justice?
Thanks so much, Sylvia, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you. And let me start, first of all, by thanking you and thanking all of those who organized this event. I remember 20 years ago or so when we did the World Report on Violence and Health, and you were involved in that at the time even, we did conclude, one of the conclusions was that elder abuse was really neglected compared to some of the other forms of violence, both in terms of the attention, the responses given, even the knowledge we had on this topic. So I'm really delighted to be here today, celebrating, if I can use this word, this International Day on the prevention of elder abuse, because it's a success, just that the day exists and that we are here with over 250 people talking about what needs to be done. So the health sector, of course, has an important role to play. Before I talk about that role, I also want to say it's one of the players. It needs to act in close collaboration with justice, social sector, and many others. But the health sector has a role to play in many different areas. One of it is advocacy, just putting the issue out there so that it's known about, so that it's talked about, so that it's recognized for the important topic it is, and that action is taken. We also have a role in terms of data collection on how big the problem is, because in many countries we still don't know much about it. It's kind of shoved away under the carpet and it can be done because the data are not there to show that probably in all countries, 1 in 6 older people are affected by this issue. Data on the magnitude, but also data on the existence of the responses. And one example of that was the global status report we at WHO issued a few years ago, where it was made clear that in many countries, there are no laws in place to protect older people from abuse, and that those countries that had laws clearly also indicated that very often these laws are actually not put in practice or not being implemented. So it's our role to not only document the magnitude, but also document the responses, the laws, and the lack of use of those laws. We also have a role in supporting the health sector in detecting and taking action. We have to train the health providers in documenting, identifying people who are affected by this problem, and also help them in getting a response, including empowering them to seek access to justice, which means reassuring them. Often they are afraid that those who are taking care of them will be going to jail, and therefore they are not willing necessarily to speak up about this issue of abuse. And finally, we have a role in supporting the older people directly, those who are affected, with the mental health support, with social service support, etc., etc. So basically, we have a big role to play.
Thank you. No doubt, no doubt. So tell us, Etienne, what are WHO plans for addressing elder abuse during the important UN Decade of Healthy Aging?
Well, we plan a lot, and I first of all want to do my mea culpa, because I wish we could do more. We are often constrained due to resources, human and financial, and I wish we could dedicate more attention and human resources than we are right now. But we're certainly planning to scale up. As you know, we're at the beginning of the decade of healthy aging. This decade of healthy aging is a fantastic platform to advance the whole healthy aging agenda, but in there also the issue of elder abuse. And there's like 4 action areas inside the plan for this decade. The first of them is ageism. Ageism contributes to normalizing abuse of older people, and therefore we have to combat ageism, and by doing that we'll combat elder abuse. The other one is making our communities better fit to empower older people, and again this will help protect them from abuse. The third one is strengthening primary care for older people, and that includes detecting elder abuse. And the last one is providing longer-term care, which again is important in order to assist those who are victims of abuse. But more specifically, we are in the process of mapping evidence on the magnitude of the problem, evidence on the consequences of elder abuse, evidence on what is being done, and also what is not being done by the different countries around the world. And therefore, we hope to identify gaps and be able to empower and push for more action in those countries where not enough is happening. And the second is to try to understand better why this issue of elder abuse is not higher on the priority list. It's such a big issue affecting so many people. Why is it not getting more attention? By trying to understand that, we hope to have enough information, both through the data, but also through understanding this lack of prioritization, to develop some kind of strategy to include action on elder abuse in a very prominent way throughout the decade of healthy aging. So, so that we don't end up in 2030 with not having more action on this so important topic. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Etienne, and we will be working with you, with WHO. We will be watching, making sure that really the interventions that we can implement are evidence-based, and I know public health has an important role to play.
Yeah, let me say how much we appreciate that collaboration. We talk on a very regular basis, and I think this collaboration between UN agencies and civil society is key if we really want to achieve success. Thanks so much, Sylvia.
Thank you, Etienne. And of course, there will never be justice unless older persons themselves are included in the conversation. And talking about asking older persons, I am inviting now Natasa Todorovic. She's the Health and Care Program Manager from the Red Cross in Serbia, and she's the INPEA representative of for Europe. And Natasa, you have recently conducted a study on violence against older women, which we need more of those studies. What can you tell us about the results and the barriers that older women encounter?
Frauen. Und wir brauchen mehr solche Studien. Was können Sie uns über diese Studie sagen?
Sorry. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon for everyone.
Guten Morgen, guten Tag.
I would like to thank Silvia, Susan, and Amal because they organized this conference. And our research was looking into protection from violence and various elements of the system, and essentially for the protection. Access to justice is one of these elements, and here we can say that the issue we have recorded are very much in line with the other similar studies have found. The common issue that we have identified that negatively affect access to justice and prevent older women from even reporting violence, including stigma and shame, especially in cases of domestic violence, reluctance to prosecute one's children, lack of information, long trials, as well as the high cost associated with the whole process. These last two issues are a major deterrent. Even in cases where the system has made visible progress in ensuring faster process and free legal assistance, the perspective among older persons is still that it does not pay to even try. They believe they will never see the end of the process. This means that outreach activities are necessary to ensure older persons know more about their rights and how to access them. Then there are ageistic prejudice against older persons about their memory being faulty or about them being unreliable witness. This also contributes to them being discouraged from even entering the process and reporting violence. All of this especially impacts older persons who are already disadvantaged. These persons who living in poverty with lower education level, living in remote areas, living with disability, those who are digitally excluded and socially isolated. We must not forget that as elder abuse has a gender face. So do the difficulties in access justice disproportionately impact older women who live longer and more likely to be at risk of poverty and social inclusion. Last but not least, older person we talked to point out the barriers to accessing justice were especially high during the COVID lockdown and COVID pandemic.
Thank you so much for that, Natasa. So how can access to justice impact the way older women report violence and the outcome of the process?
Our study primarily looked into access to justice in case of, our research showed that 60% of older women age 65 to 74 experience some form of violence after reaching 65. Our study primarily looked into access to justice in cases of violence against older women, but it should be understood that barriers in accessing justice exist in any other area of life. This includes property, but also exercising the rights to healthcare and social welfare support. Barriers to these rights are equally real and represent a form of structural violence against older persons too. Let us remember the justice system is for the most part still blind to older persons, just as they are to a significant degree unaware of their legal rights and existing mechanisms. Providing procedural and age-appropriate accommodations in the system is, of course, only one step in the right direction. We must also think about the need to educate older persons about the rights they have and resources at their disposal. We must encourage them and support them every step of the way. On the other hand, we need to work with all professionals, especially professionals in the justice system, and ensure that they know that one-size-fits-all approach does not really fit everyone equal, and that they need to be actively reaching out to older persons. Improving access to the justice is a matter of trust as well. If we expect older persons to report violence, they also must expect the system to work for them and with them, just as for any other population in society. All of this should be considering in the light of our joint and continued efforts to leave no one behind.
Thank you so much, Natasha. And I move straight to the last panelist, so we have time to come back to all of you with questions. And there are a lot of questions and comments coming in from the audience, so I do want to do them justice. And I am very happy to welcome my friend Bill Mitchell. He's a principal solicitor in Townsville Community Law Incorporated in Australia. And he's an expert in access to justice. Bill.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here tonight. Can I first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm coming to you from, which is the Turrbal people here in Brisbane, where I'm down here for a conference. There's been some very interesting points made already, but I think it's very important to highlight the size of the problem firstly. If 1 in 2 people hold ageist attitudes, if 1 in 6 older persons experience elder abuse, if the predominant people who experience the ill effects of COVID, including poor health and death, are older persons, then why don't we have a statement of rights that is adjusted to their needs, that is specific to the experiences they have that are different to everybody else? We already know that ageism may well be more pervasive than sexism and racism. And for older persons who experience intersecting structural inequality, such as Aboriginal women in Australia who experience gender-related violence, who experience discrimination on the basis of race and also age, we see that the problem is very large and very complex. So I think if we had a guiding normative statement that said older persons have a right to access justice, as well as all those other things that Dr. Krug mentioned, the right to be free from violence, abuse and neglect, if all of these things were enshrined in a global standard, the national governments would have a baseline from which to work. We would also have a baseline from which we could assess and judge the work of national governments and across regions. So I guess that's the simple message, is that we have a very large problem of which access to justice is just one part. But we know that access to justice is a cross-cutting right. And it's a bit like autonomy. If all the human rights are steps in a ladder, and if access to justice is the bottom rung, and if it's missing, then you simply cannot access the other rights that you have.
Thank you. So again, as always, taking one right away is taking all rights away. And this is a very important message. In your experience, Bill, what would be the best service model to respond to the acute needs of older persons? And are there legal practices that could be exacerbate the abuse that one experiences?
Well, the justice system is absolutely full of practices that discriminate against older persons. They're not treated as valuable witnesses or jurors. They're not worth the same level of compensation as other people. They're not trusted to be working within the system when they're older. But much, much more than that, there are many ways that justice services can be adapted to older persons' needs. In Australia and in Queensland, where I'm from, we have a specialist older persons legal service that actually does some things that are uncommon these days. For example, we go and see older people in their home if they'd like. The days of home visiting for many services outside long-term care are quite rare. And if people don't want to come to, if they don't want us to come to their home, we'll pay and make sure they can come and see us. We take a whole range of other practices that are adapted to their needs. We never ever presume that they lack capacity. We never ever see them with another person that might be coercing them or controlling them. So we've really built a practice around a model that respects the autonomy of older persons and respects their decisions in legal processes. And I think someone mentioned earlier that many decisions around elder abuse are difficult because it might well be the primary carer who's also the primary perpetrator. And so we have to also be very respectful and have a client-centered practice. I can certainly circulate the model that we use, and there are many good things that come from that. But of course, if we had a global standard that said these are the critical issues that older persons need in accessing justice, then it wouldn't be too hard for other national governments to use that same model and to create systems that were adapted to their needs. For example, age friendliness, the WHO's age friendliness is completely dependent on access to justice. You simply cannot have access to those domains unless you've got access to justice as well. So these things are all interconnected. We can't ignore one for the other. But I think the WHO's report on ageism is a very stark reminder that whilst the prevalence data says 1 in 2 people hold ageist attitudes, we must presume that those attitudes are manifesting in ageist behaviours. And so the size of the problem is very large. So we definitely have to take stock of where we're at and think about what standard do older persons need above and beyond other people, and what are the special characteristics or accommodations that we need to put into play for them.
Thank you. And you have, in fact, answered some of the questions that have been coming in. In fact, well, because there are issues that really are of concern, like there was one question of, we know that some of the abuses are, in fact, the families. So how can a person access justice when lives within the milieu, on a family circle that is abusive? So this is one question, but I want to ask a question first to Maria Soledad before she leaves, because she has to go to the Conference of State Parties. And there was a question from Erika Dar, who asked, did the CRPD protect persons with disabilities during COVID? Was any help in having that convention during COVID? María Soledad, ¿me has entendido la pregunta? ¿Me escuchas, María Soledad? Sí.
Bueno, por supuesto que sí, nos ayudó mucho, porque en base a la convención se pudieron realizar muchas acciones específicas en relación a los estados, a las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, sector privado, distintas partes interesadas, para precisamente ir acotando cuál se veían que eran las necesidades más acuciantes. De hecho, en mi carácter de enviada especial del secretario general en discapacidad y accesibilidad, hicimos con la experta independiente de aquel momento del año pasado una declaración, un statement que se refería al derecho a la vida para las personas con discapacidad, para las personas mayores, cuando estaba todo el dilema de la última cama, el último respirador mecánico. E hicimos también otro con ella en relación a la situación de las mujeres y las niñas con discapacidad y las mujeres mayores. Así que claro que sirve, y en los poderes judiciales, yendo al acceso a la justicia, claro que es útil porque es un instrumento que ya está ratificado casi universal por 184 países. Entonces tiene una fuerza, un imperio importante, y por lo mismo será bueno que tengamos una convención de adultos mayores, de personas mayores.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. So yes, the answer yes, having an instrument did help during COVID. At least there was a record, a possibility to access a recourse. I understand from Maria Soledad and from others. There are several questions, several people asking regarding health and the impact of abuse on health and the role of the health carers. And maybe at the end, maybe you could take this question. Somebody's asking about you mentioned the importance of training of healthcare. This is Dr. Shantu Watt is asking, training for particular health staff to identify and indicate abuse. Are there examples of willing health authorities, and actually also examples of those who are reluctant to embark in more responsibilities or additional work? Can you tell us a bit about that?
I don't think there is reluctance from those who know and have the means, but I think we could perceive as reluctance, lack of action, which in my view is mainly due to ignorance about how big the issue is. It's ignorance about what can be done about it, and probably competing priorities. And we've seen, particularly now with the COVID pandemic, how strong the competing priorities can be. But that's why I think it's up to us, the health sector, the international agencies, NGOs, to make noise around this issue, to make clear that it exists. First of all, it's a bigger issue than people think. It's all over in high income, in low income, in middle income countries and settings, and that something can be done about it. That, you know, we need to speak up, we need to break the taboos, we need to have the right legislation, we need to have empowered health service providers, we need to have a judicial system that addresses the issue, etc., etc. So I think the perceived reluctance is probably much more linked to ignorance and lack of understanding of what can be done about it. And of course, you know, there are resource issues everywhere, but these issues usually don't cost so much money. It's not an issue of financial resources, in my view. It's really an issue of breaking taboos, speaking up, and making people understand what can be done about it.
Thank you. And I link that to another question that I invite the other panelists to respond. And I will say 3 questions, and then you can take the questions that you want. Because there are things that are coming in the comments as well, the recognition of ageism, and of course, healthcare workers or social workers are not exempt from ageist attitudes either. So one person, in the chat, somebody's asked the importance of social workers and relating to older persons in long-term care facilities or not in facilities, and on the concerns of not interfering with the autonomy of older persons. So how can we really, where is the balance between safety and autonomy? So this is a big question, and let you think about it. Another person, I mentioned the question about the families, but there is another question or comment about the issues of timeliness. Older persons, the judiciary processes, justice is a slow process. However, some older persons do not have a long time to live. So how can this be made really adequate for people who need a speedy process? And maybe those 2 questions. And somebody else is mentioning if anybody would like to relate to the Inter-American Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, and what is the relation with the connection there with access to justice in in the Inter-American Convention. So maybe Claudia, would you like to relate to one of the questions?
Sure, thank you. These are, many different issues you just spoke about, but maybe I just start with, from my perspective, one of the easier things is the timeliness. As we all know, there are a couple of issues where you can speed up proceedings, and we are all aware of this, that there are different things here. And I think what we have also seen here in the example of the Inter-American Convention is that they already draw attention to this specific issue. And from my perspective, as I already said, we need speedy proceedings in the court procedures, but it might also be good to have procedures before the court, which might solve the problem much more easier and give more relevance to a timely outcome and solve the problem more easily. And I would also like to refer to Bill's example, that they have specific persons to support and assist older persons in this regard. And I think this is all the needed. And in case of judicial personnel, we also need some kind of training there, because from my perspective, older persons are very invisible in this system, and a lot of ageist attitudes are not only within the person, but also in the system and the laws itself. So maybe I'll stop here and give the floor to others. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Bill, maybe you want to take one of the questions?
Sure. I mean, I'd like to address the same question in a broader context. I think the research, there's very little legal needs research done on older persons' issues. And so we don't actually know much about what their legal needs are. What we do know is that they're less likely to take legal action. They're less likely to finalise that legal action. And when they do finalise it, they're less likely to get a good outcome. And so we know that the problem starts way back, not just at the point of the courthouse, which of course is the very end of the process. So we need to be making sure that in fact, older people are aware of their legal rights, have supportive mechanisms to enforce those legal rights, but also to make sure we're actually creating legal rights around the issues that they need them for. And so we do need a bit of a redesign of the broader system. And as I've said a few times, really a statement of older persons' rights, like a global convention, would be the one document where we've spent 10 years already talking about what rights issues older persons have. Now, if we got to the end of the decade of healthy aging, which is 10 years, and we'd had no better healthy aging, we would be very unhappy. How have we gotten to the end of 10 years of the open-ended working group and we still haven't got there? So we have a whole catalogue of legal rights that we need to start looking at, and then wonder, well, why aren't these rights being enforced? Well, it's plain to see we don't have a roadmap of legal rights that older people need. We do need to start from scratch, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Bill. And I see that Maria Soledad has raised her hand. Maria Soledad, ¿quieres decir algo?
Sí, porque creo que es muy importante la Convención Internacional sobre Derechos de Personas Mayores, ya que será un instrumento vinculante, obligatorio para los países y que les ayudará en sus políticas internas, incluso los poderes judiciales. Y por otro lado, y no quiero dejar de mencionar los plazos de cumplimiento de esto, porque el acceso a la justicia, y mirado desde el punto de vista de la Convención en Discapacidad que he comentado, o la Convención Interamericana que también hice referencia, son normas de derechos humanos, por lo mismo son autoejecutables, self-executive. Entonces, es importante que tengamos presente esto. Ahora, si alguien dice, bueno, son normas que requieren una programación de implementación, por ejemplo, la accesibilidad en los tribunales, las reformas legales que sea necesario, bueno, la Agenda 2030 nos deja 9 años de plazo. O sea, al 2030 tiene que estar el acceso a la justicia para todos. Entonces es importante comprender, vincular, entrelazar estos instrumentos de derechos humanos y de desarrollo sostenible también. Y creo que después de 10 años discutiendo el tema, ya es hora que podríamos comenzar con esta convención, allá los pasos fuertes. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti, gracias a ti. And thank you so much. There are so many questions and I know that time is short, but I want to try to do justice really to as many people as possible, even if you will forgive me if I shorten them. Some of them are quite long in the Q&As on the chat, but there is one question at the end that I want to pose you, but before that, I would like Natasha to ask Natasha the issue of autonomy and the intersection between gender and aging and the issues with older women in your study. Did they refer to the issue of losing their autonomy?
In our study, yes, they are said when they lose their autonomy, they rely on somebody or family members, and then they are in risk of elder abuse. And that's, but in our research, in our sample, only one older woman officially reporting to being targeted by abuse. From 500 people, older women, only one reporting, and that's a big problem. And I would like just to say, access to justice is not one-way street. We need to educate older persons, but as you said, we need to educate police, judges, health workers, people who work, social workers, of course, people who work with older people in long-term care, not only people who do this care, but people who are working in long-term care as who are cooking or doing something for the older people. We need to educate all the people who are working with older people.
Thank you, Natasha. And Etienne, I come back to you because there is this important question from Canada saying that palliative care workers in Canada, they witness challenges in accessing controlled essential medicines such as morphine. The stigma around dependence is a root cause for poor access in the First Nations that they serve. I'm sure that Bill will probably see the same issues in Australia. And so COVID has stressed global supply chains for controlled medicines that are unfit for purpose. So she pleads, and what can we do together to combat this shocking neglect, the neglect of, and I would add to that, on one hand, the lack of access to palliative care, the lack of palliative care. On the other hand, the excess of over-medication that some older persons do suffer. And I think did Etienne disappear or just from my screen?
No, I'm still there.
Okay. Here, sorry. So how can we do better in access to palliative care on the one hand? On the other hand, how can we stop the chemical abuse that older persons suffer?
Well, you're opening a whole issue there. It's a big, complex problem, of course. But yeah, I think we're making progress on palliative care. There is quite a bit of good experience now in many countries of what can be done. We need to continue rolling it out, and I'm sure COVID hasn't helped because of, again, the lack of the diversion of resources and attention towards treating the disease and responding to the disease, and has separated people and not allowed people to be with their loved ones at the last stages of life. It has been a terrible experiences in many ways for many people, and I think for the whole field of palliative care. But I hope quite soon we can continue the progress that we had seen before and roll out some of the good examples in many countries, including in Canada, of high quality palliative care. But of course, palliative care comes with challenges of access to medicine, of not over medicating, not abusing some of those medicines, and we have to strike there's a very delicate balance between providing the access but not going too far and not overusing some of these medicines.
But
I think
yeah.
Sorry.
There are two different issues. In fact, I put them together around the issues of medicine, but palliative care, we will agree that nobody has to suffer from pain. But the other issue is the abuse that older persons suffer because medicines are misused to control the behavior of older persons. And that is a type of abuse indeed that is quite common in high income countries. And before we go, and there are many questions that remain unanswered, and we will probably not have all the answers today. But there is one general question about reporting. We hear this is an issue that comes back and again, not enough people report elder abuse. But of course, can we report if there is no legal framework in place? Who are we reporting to? How we will be accessing justice if police or the social or service workers are not aware of what elder abuse is? So these are big questions, and I think that we have a lot of work in the next few years, and we hope that, as Bill was saying, that at the end of the decade of healthy aging, that we can have a clear view that some issues that we have solved. But before we go, I would like to ask each of you one takeaway message from today's discussion related to access to justice. A very small, less than 1 minute. What would be your takeaway message? Can I ask Claudia first?
Thank you. I think my major takeaway is still we need more support and assistance to older persons to give them the avenue for access to justice and include older persons also in the different views of judicial system and healthcare workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Etienne?
No, I think we're making progress. I saw just Leah Deichmann's name pop up there, and Leah will remember from a long time ago how few of us were speaking about this issue. There is a movement emerging. There is more talk about it. There is more attention. We just have to accelerate and make much more noise. We need a vibrant, vocal civil society that makes even more noise than we're doing now. We need to empower older people to speak up about their experiences and what has helped them. And we need all of us really to, I think, feel empowered to do more and to put this issue more in the forefront. But I'm optimistic.
Thank you. We will remain optimistic. Bill, what is your take? No, Natasha, we'll ask Natasha first.
Okay, as Bill said, we achieve a lot, but not enough. I believe that we are on the right way to achieving universal access to the justice for older person by advocating for the new UN Convention of the Rights of Older Persons.
Thank you, Natasha. Now, Bill, I think that Maria Soledad just left us for the Conference of State Parties. So you'll, Bill.
Well, looking at those two examples that were just given, the lack of palliative care and the use of restrictive practices, one of those examples is us thinking we know better than older people, and the other one is not trusting that they know well enough for themselves. And so we need to see them as rights holders, and the only way that's going to happen is if they have a set of rights that they can rely upon.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Susan, did I forget any panelists? Or Susan, do you want to have a takeaway message? If not, I will close, and I think that really thank you for joining us today. I think this was a very interesting thoughts from both the panelists and from the audience with a lot of comments, and the majority are placing elder abuse and access to justice within the larger context of ageism in society. So we do need to work on both the broader determinants, but also be specific in the legal access to justice and see older persons as full citizen rights. So we do hope that you enjoyed our discussion and that you leave